Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcologist. I'm Dr. Krishnanand and you have been watching my videos on various topics of geography, models and theories in human geography of late. In this series, we are going to learn about one of the very interesting topics which came after World War II in the arena of geography, and that was related to growth pole model, or we say growth pole theory. So what is this growth pole? Remember, growth pole is a concept which is combination of economics and geography together. So here we are going to talk about the growth factor, the economics factor, as well as the polarity. And also remember, this concept has a basic principle where polarization of space is important. So all these aspects, its attributes, its application, its criticism, we are going to learn. Now remember, this theory in 1955 was given by Francois Perroux, and he was an economist in France. So let's understand the contribution of Francois Perroux, and before we go ahead, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and do share the videos with others as well. So now let's learn about growth pole theory given by Francois Perroux in the year 1955. Now remember, Perroux was basically a French economist and he was outspoken about corporatism. He wanted the development through corporates, right? So the concept of growth pole was given in 1955, that is when the post-World War development was happening around the world, right? The new form of economic reforms, the urban restructuring, development of suburbia, and so many other factors were dominated across the world urban areas, across the world regions. So in this time, when growth pole theory was propounded, when it came, it was very important for many countries, especially developing countries like India, to adopt this theory. And let's learn about the mechanism and important premise that is the core building block of this theory. So remember, this talked about uneven and non-uniform growth in a region. Now the basic premise of building of this theory was that growth is not uniform everywhere. If we look into Indian example itself, you find that from north to south and east to west, India does not have similar kind of economic growth. Only few centers, few bigger cities, historically which have been bigger, and for several other reasons which have been of importance, they are only growing at a faster rate. Rest of them are just following them. Right? So we have important growth poles, that is what is important here, because of non-uniformity in this space, in the economic space, right? So the field of regional economics, or what we say regional development, was basically the Francois Perroux's work, and his contribution was basically the poles de Croissancenon, which is growth poles. Right? So the empirical inductive model based on data surveys, empiricism, direct observation is what this theory is. Right? So it implied that government policies aimed at regeneration of a specific local region were critically dependent. The word is critically dependent. It means of greater importance upon input-output linkages. Now remember, this is something which is important for any industrial setup, for any developmental setup, that what is the input coming in and what is the output that is going out of the industry. If we are establishing an economic firm or we are developing an industry, where are we getting our raw material from? Where is the labor coming from? And several other factors that we also talked in agricultural theory, in the industrial theory, in central place theory. So this theory in 1955 had elements of all the previous locational analysis in economic geography and human geography as well. So remember, this pole de Croissancenon, or what we say is growth poles, is basically what? It's an industry or a group of related industries. Remember, it can also be group, which is agglomeration of industries as well, right? So that have growth rates above a national average. It's important to observe here that national average is the baseline. If that industry or group of industry is growing at a faster rate than what is national average, then it is basically behaving like a growth pole, right? And the capacity to regenerate growth through the impact of strong input-output linkages. It's not just about growing themselves. Rather, it is growing the entire region gradually because of the linkages that we say. That is also called inter-industry linkages, right? So in general, what we observe, growth poles are basically the first rank cities, or we can also say they are the primate cities in developing countries as well, where agglomeration of many activities can be seen in this concept, right? So now let's understand the entire structure of this growth pole theory and how it can be applied in various situations, right? So first of all, before actually going to growth pole theory, let's remember another gentleman here called Schumpeter, who was basically the inspiration for Perroux. So Schumpeter's analysis in his work is based on history of economic analysis. You see this in 1942. Now historical analysis of economic space is what Schumpeter worked out, and he talked about that development occurs as a result of discontinuous spurts. It was not continuous, it was not uniform. Growth was not uniform, it was a dynamic world. Right? The cause of discontinuous spurt is basically innovative entrepreneur whose activities take place in a large scale firm. So it was more about entrepreneur in a particular region who is as powerful enough to create innovations, to create this development, right? To have this impetus to create greater development. So growth pole basically is what? It's a dynamic and highly integrated set of industries which can create or produce a propulsion. Remember jet propulsion, the push that is given to the jet, that is where propulsive word has been used here. Propulsive leading industry. So what is the concept? In a region for development, you need a propulsive industry, which was coming from the idea of this gentleman Schumpeter, which was used by Perroux to understand and conceptualize this growth pole. So what is here? This kind of relationship what you see here. Propeller and propelled relationship, dominant and dominated relationship. This kind of relationship exists in the initial days, and then gradually the entire economy is boosted up and the regional development comes up. So basically, first of all, there has to be a propulsive industry which has enough power, enough innovative power to create this kind of propulsion in the area for greater development, to bring that continuous growth, right? So it dominates virtually, right? So smaller linkages that it creates with the different small industries is what is the first parameter here to describe the growth pole, that it must be a propulsive firm, a dominant firm, which will be the most dominant firm in the region or most dominant industry in the region, right? So for example, if you say Indian context, the Tata Iron and Steel Company, right? So it is one of the biggest in Jharkhand area right now. And remember, it is also associated to small industries, right? So what is happening? Input and output linkages. Raw material is coming from mining areas, labor supply is coming, skilled labor supply is coming, management is there. So kind of an agglomeration has happened so that a greater development can take place, right? So the whole region around the Tata Iron and Steel Company will be known as the growth pole, which will propel the growth in the entire region. That's the whole idea behind it. Is it doing so or not? That is a question of analysis further. But this is one example that you can quote in terms of India. And remember, in 1950s and 60s, we were also establishing greater iron and steel industries and companies, and also steel cities in India develops in 1950s and 60s. So basically what you observe, this theory has been applied in the early plans, early first few 5-year plans in India. So the central idea of this growth pole theory is economic development or growth, which is non-uniform, happens always around a center, which is a cluster, also a pole. So this pole is nothing, it's just like a pivot around which the entire growth happens, right? So that is where growth polarity is talked about. So pole is often characterized by what? Core industry, also called key industry. Now what are these core industry? Core industries are those heavy industries or those propulsive industry which are having greater capacity, greater finance, and all those strengths which are required to innovate, to have greater impact of the development. So what you observe here, that there are core industries and there are linked industries, right? So core industries can be, for example, automotive, aeronautical engineering, agri-businesses, electronics, and steel, petrochemical. These are heavy, big industries which are having enough potential to also push the adjoining linkages industries, right, to grow further in its attachment. So if you observe this diagram, what you observe? In the initial phase, you have only one core industry, and in association we have linkages of others, right? So this is kind of a cluster which is there called growth pole. And eventually what happens, there is an emergence of secondary growth pole from the first growth pole, and gradually there is an entire region that will develop. This was envisaged, this was envisioned by Perroux, right? So the expansion of the core industry implies what? Expansion of output, employment, related investments, and also new technologies and newer industrial sectors. This is what we say is diffusion of innovation to the greater area from a center, from a pole, right? That was the core building block concept of this theory. So concepts in this particular model, if you observe, is basically what? Concept of economic space, right? And it was taken for the French economy that was there at that particular time. So that was empirically observed and analyzed, where economic space was defined, and concept of leading industry, one industry that leads over the others around the area and has input-output linkages. So that was important. For example, cotton textile industry can be taken as one example, which leads to further development of other small raw material producing industries as well. Then concept of this propulsive firm became very important. That particular firm which has enough energy to propel others as well, not just itself, right? It has greater risk-taking capabilities. So if you want to understand the characteristics of propulsive firm, what are the characteristics? Highly advanced level of technology should be there, managerial expertise should be there, then high income elasticity of demand for its product should be there, right? Then marked local multiplier effect. Now this is very interesting. Local multiplier effect. A propulsion means it multiplies in the locality. You have one big industry coming in some area, you will find gradually small industries coming in its vicinity to support it and also gain from it. That is where it keeps multiplying. So it has a local multiplier effect. That is what is important here, and strong inter-industry linkages with other sectors. So that's where agglomeration factor comes into the picture. So one propulsive firm will lead to greater industrialization, greater development, greater growth in a given region. That is the whole idea. Now coming to the fourth concept, that is concept of polarization. Now remember, the pole word itself is what is polarized concept, right? It is centric concept, that one center with the greater amount of developed area, the concentration, the centralization concept in central place theory, if you remember, that this has the greater production center, greater production value, all the skilled labors come there, all the raw materials come to that center for the processing. So that is where it pulls capital, resources, labors, entrepreneurship from the surrounding area. This is where polarization starts to happen. So in a given space, what you understand, only one area becomes center, and it has coming from all areas is the resources, the capital, the labor. So it is basically creating a pole. Just like we have North Pole and South Pole on the basis of magnetism, remember, this is also a pole only on the basis of the economic nature, right? That's important here. So this is essential to become a large growth pole in a region and bring development. That was important. And polarization process also have certain types. So basic types of polarization are mentioned here. If you can observe, technological and technical polarization. So if a particular area has greater technology, greater advancement, that is becoming a growth pole. It can be on the basis of income as well. So the growth pole contributes to the concentration and high growth in given areas. For example, big cities in India you can take as growth pole for the financial part, or you can say for the income, right? So people always move towards city to fetch more income, which they cannot otherwise get in the rural areas, right? Then there is also a psychological polarization. Remember, this psychology is about optimistic anticipation of greater development at a given area. For example, New Delhi, or for example, Mumbai. Every day from all walks of life, people travel to this city, thousands of people. In what? In aspiration that they will also earn more money. They will have a better lifestyle if they go to cities, because they can fetch more, they can earn more. This is also psyche, a psychology which is in terms of polarization, if you can understand, right? So that happens. And the fourth one is obviously geography based, that is geographical polarization on the basis of concentration of economic activity in a given region, right? For example, if you take in Delhi NCR, it is basically polarized on the basis of one aspect that we can say is medical institute, because All India Institute of Medical Sciences was first established here, or on the basis of what you can say because it's power capital, because you have all the national heading offices here in New Delhi, or we can say University of Delhi as a polarized center for education. So what you observe, all kinds of polarization available in Delhi. So Delhi becomes a polarized space, or for example, a growth pole in India. We can observe like that, isn't it? So geography also plays, or location also plays a important role. If you observe Chota Nagpur Plateau as a mineral belt of India, what is there? You have the polarization on the basis of geography there, right? So all the iron and steel industries are located there. So these are different kinds of polarization in space that we observe here. So the next concept is the concept of linkages. Now what do you mean by linkages? How an industry is linked with the other smaller industries for its raw materials, for its produce, and how it processes it and gives it to the further. So one is backward, one is forward. So what you observe here, motor vehicles industry, for example, has forward linkages. With what? With marketing services, advertising, insurance, while backward linkages are with iron and steel industry, rubber industry, isn't it? So what you observe, you have an industry here and you have labor, you have utilities, you have parts and transportation, right? Which is part of the backward linkages. While in your forward linkages, you move your produce from the industry to these exports, to the household consumption, to the value-added manufacturing, to advertisement sectors and others. Right? So this is how these linkages operate with leading propulsive industry. That's an important concept. Then what we have is the sixth concept in this particular theory, that is concept of agglomeration. Agglomeration is a combination or accumulation of number of basic and heavy industries coming together and making it a huge propulsive economic space, or a dominant space that we say in terms of growth pole. So it involves what? Growth of infrastructure, research and development together with the entire production that is happening there, right? So agglomeration of various factors. Now remember, growth, because it's not uniform, it also is divided into several stages. Now what are the stages? First is the stationary growth. What is here in the stationary growth? Only one center is having the growth, rest others are just passive, right? So stationary growth are just utilization of the resources, the immobile capital, labor, and just having enough propensity of development at that particular location, but not anywhere else. That is the initial stage. Stationary growth is happening. Then centralization on that basis happens. So centralization means that factors of production are centralized in a given space. Only that space is having central economy of that entire region, right? So all the value added economic services are only put in that place. So it becomes a central place, right? And then polarization is when it becomes more big, it becomes a growth pole. So what you see, Myrdal's concept, what was there? Cumulative causation model. Remember, Gunnar Myrdal was an economist. So he talked about cumulative causation. Cumulative is combination of several causes leading to a polarity in a region. So that happens at the third stage, where you have a leading industry or a propulsive firm that develops a point of centralization in such a way that it starts to become a pivot, a pole of development, right? And this polarization has been in detail talked in the theory of Gunnar Myrdal in terms of spread effect as well as backwash effect. So what is backwash effect and what is spread effect is again the same thing, that is based on input model and output model. So if you look here in the agglomeration phase, in the next phase, what happens after polarity, the interlinkages start to accentuate, to establish in a greater way. So growth pole is developed over economic space where polarization and agglomerations have taken place, and the area surrounding the growth pole is almost like a desert. It does not have much of development because it is like island of development in agglomeration phase. Every small economy is being agglomerated to that big one, right? But in the last stage of growth pole is what is important here for developing economies. That then starts the other process called trickle down effect. It means now it starts to grow. So when growth pole is done with its own development, it starts to go out like a centrifuge. It starts to go out of this particular location and starts the development trickling down, moving away. That is called spread effect in terms of Myrdal's theory, and also known as this trickle down effect in the word coined by Professor Hirschman. Right? They're all economists. So decentralization starts of industry. When the cluster is saturated, industries move out, development move out, they trickle down gradually to the outer spaces, right? So dispersal of capitals happen, diffusion of innovation happen, and diversification of industry happen. This is the characteristics of the fifth stage of growth pole, right? So in these steps, a growth pole develops, and gradually what happens is regional development. That's where this concept is important in regional development theory and also regional economics. So keeping in mind this growth pole theory, what can be understood? That India in second 5-year plan, that we famously know by Nehru-Mahalanobis model, established its various iron and steel cities that we talked about, right? Durgapur, Vilai, Rourkela, all these steel plants develops in 50s and 60s, right? And what is there? The technology comes from Germany, Russia, right? And what we have is we start producing manufacturing steel. And this steel was the building block of India. All our metro cities were built on the steel produced in these cities, isn't it? So that led to this diffusion of innovation from those particular center. But also it is criticized on the same point because they started to become island of development because of polarization. If you go to these cities like Durgapur, Rourkela, Vilai, Jamshedpur, if you go to these cities, you will find that only the township area is well developed. When you go out of these townships, you will not find that kind of infrastructure, not a continuum of urbanization, what you see here, right? So the trickle down is still to happen. That is where we say that growth pole theory failed in its completeness. Only it can be applied in one part till the polarization and innovation, right? So these places became islands of development, antagonic to what the entire process of growth pole is in Indian context, right? So what we observe, the criticism, the critical evaluation of this theory also gives insight to these factors. So growth pole concept was intended for rapid economic growth, which was important, and in short span of time. That was very important here. But in place of its origin, it failed as reflected in the Paris and French desert area, if you observe, right? It means Paris developed like a big city, and other cities, the second, third, fourth ranking cities in the area could not get as much importance Paris got, right? So Paris really becomes so huge growth pole in France that other cities, even many people don't know the names of second, third, fourth cities in France, isn't it? France is only known by Paris. So that started happening, right? No trickle down happened. So trickle down stage and decentralization have not operated the way it was proposed in the model as we were talking, right? So islands of developments were created. Growth pole was projected as an alternative model to central place theory. But idealistically, it failed because it could not serve the purpose of this overall development of a country, right? So economic space, this idea has been criticized by many scholars, and in the next lecture we also talk about one of the scholars which talked about growth center theory, right? Not growth pole theory. So growth center approach was kind of modification by another French economist, Boudeville. So Boudeville's theory replaced it with geographical space rather than just economic space, and talked about it to actually make it suited to larger portions of the earth, different countries, different areas, especially developing economies, right? So in details we learn about Boudeville's theory in separate lecture. So I hope you understood in details about this growth pole theory, its understanding, its concept within it, the polarization of space, its various characteristics, and also its application across India as well. So now, when we have learned about the details of growth pole theory, its various aspects, in the sessions to come, we'll be talking more on growth center, growth foci. So stay tuned, stay safe, keep learning, keep watching. My best wishes to all of you.